"Hey babe, do you think we could stop by Darren's place after dinner tonight?" Dorothy asked, setting down the plates, mingling with the aroma of roasted chicken and rosemary potatoes. Blake looked up from his phone, eyebrows knitting together. "Darren's? What for?" His tone was neutral, but a hint of curiosity lingered beneath it. Dorothy shrugged, taking a seat across from him. "Just a quick visit. He's having a little get-together. Thought it'd be nice to catch up with some old friends." Her smile was bright, almost too bright, and she seemed overly interested in the food on her plate as she spoke. Blake hesitated, the fork halfway to his mouth. Darren was his best friend from college, and they hadn't hung out in a while. It wasn't a strange request, but something in Dorothy's voice, the way she avoided his eyes, made him pause. He let the feeling sit for a moment, then shrugged it off. "Yeah, sure. Sounds like fun," Blake replied, returning her smile. He took a bite of his food, chewing slowly as his mind wandered. Dinner unfolded in the usual way: talk of work, weekend plans, and casual jokes about their busy schedules. Dorothy laughed at the right moments, made all the right comments, but Blake couldn't shake the feeling that there was a tension beneath her words. Something that wasn't quite right. "How was work today?" Blake asked, more out of habit than interest, as he reached for his glass of water. "Busy, as usual. Meetings, deadlines, the usual chaos," Dorothy replied with a chuckle, spearing a piece of chicken with her fork. "How about you? Anything exciting?" Blake shook his head. "Not really. Just the same old stuff. Maybe I'll take a day off next week, do something different for a change." Dorothy nodded, her gaze drifting to the window. "That sounds nice. We could use a break." Her words hung in the air, and Blake noticed the way she said, "we" instead of "you." He watched her for a moment, the way her fingers tapped lightly against the edge of her plate, her eyes distant. It was as if her mind was somewhere else, far away from their kitchen table. "So, who's going to be at Darren's tonight?" Blake asked, trying to bring her back into the conversation. "Oh, you know, the usual crowd. Darren, Jason, a few others. It's nothing big, just a small gathering." Dorothy's response was quick, almost rehearsed. Blake nodded slowly. "Sounds good." He couldn't help but notice that she still hadn't looked him in the eye since she'd mentioned the party. As they finished dinner, Blake found himself going through the motions, cleaning up the dishes and putting away leftovers. Dorothy was right there with him, working alongside him as they cleared the table and washed up. But the more he watched her, the more he noticed the subtle changes. The way her smile didn't quite reach her eyes, the way her laughter seemed a little too forced. "Are you sure you're okay?" Blake asked as he dried his hands on a towel. "You seem a little off tonight." Dorothy looked up, her expression unreadable for a moment before she smiled. "I'm fine, really, just tired, I guess. It's been a long week." Blake nodded, but the unease in his chest didn't go away. He walked over to her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "If there's anything on your mind, you can tell me." Dorothy's smile wavered for a second before she reached up and squeezed his hand. "I know, Blake, thanks. I'm okay though, really." Blake didn't push it any further. He kissed her on the forehead, letting the moment pass. But as they prepared to leave for Darren's, the nagging feeling that something wasn't right lingered in the back of his mind. They drove in silence, the car's engine the only sound, as they made their way to Darren's place. Blake glanced over at Dorothy a few times, but she was focused on the road ahead, her expression calm, almost too calm. He wanted to ask her again if she was sure about going, but the words didn't come. When they finally pulled up to Darren's house, Blake couldn't shake the sense of unease that had settled over him. Something was off, but he couldn't put his finger on it. As they walked up to the door, Dorothy reached out and took his hand, squeezing it lightly. "Thanks for coming with me," she said, her voice soft. "Of course," Blake replied, but the unease was still there, gnawing at him as they stepped inside. The night was just beginning, but Blake couldn't shake the feeling that it was the start of something much darker, something he couldn't yet see coming. Blake's attention was immediately drawn to the number of cars lined up along the street. There were more vehicles than usual, a lot more. He glanced at Dorothy, who sat beside him in silence, her gaze fixed straight ahead. "Looks like a full house," Blake said, hoping to break the silence that had settled between them. "Yeah, should be fun," Dorothy responded, her tone flat, almost as if she were reading from a script. Blake's brow furrowed slightly, but he chose not to press further. Instead, he parked the car and stepped out, glancing back at Dorothy as she slowly followed suit. They walked up the driveway together, but the usual lightheartedness that accompanied their outings was absent. Something about tonight felt different, off. When they reached the door, it swung open before they could knock. Darren stood there with his usual wide grin, his arms outstretched. "Blake, Dorothy, glad you could make it," he exclaimed, pulling them both into a hug that was just a little too enthusiastic. "Good to see you, man," Blake replied, returning the embrace. Dorothy gave Darren a quick hug, then stepped back, her smile tight. The sound of laughter and music spilled out from the house as they stepped inside. Blake scanned the room, taking in the scene. The house was buzzing with activity, people chatting, glasses clinking, and music playing just loud enough to drown out individual conversations. But there was something off about the atmosphere, something Blake couldn't quite put his finger on. "Come on in, grab a drink," Darren said, guiding them toward the living room. As they moved through the house, Blake noticed a mix of familiar and unfamiliar faces. There were a few people he recognized, friends from college, some of Darren's old work buddies, but many were strangers. The women were dressed more provocatively than usual, and the men carried an odd energy, a certain gleam in their eyes that set Blake on edge. Dorothy drifted toward the makeshift bar, grabbing a glass of wine as soon as they entered the living room. She sipped quickly, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for someone or something. Blake watched her, a growing sense of unease tightening in his chest. "What's going on here, Dorothy?" Blake asked quietly, leaning in close so that only she could hear. Dorothy turned to him, her smile strained. "It's just a party, babe. Relax," she said, her voice dismissive. But there was an edge to her words that made Blake uneasy. Blake's eyes narrowed slightly as he looked around again. The room was packed with people, yet the conversation seemed too hushed, the laughter too forced. He noticed Darren whispering something to a woman he didn't recognize, and the way she laughed in response, too loud, too eager, only added to his discomfort. "Are you sure this is just a get-together?" Blake pressed, his voice low. Dorothy sighed, taking another sip of her wine. "Blake, it's fine. Don't worry so much. We're here to have fun, okay?" Blake nodded slowly, but couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. Dorothy's behavior, the strange energy in the room, the unfamiliar faces, it all added up to a growing sense of dread. He decided to stick close to Dorothy, unwilling to let her out of his sight. As the night wore on, Blake noticed more unsettling details. People were pairing off, disappearing into different rooms, their interactions too intimate for a casual gathering. The laughter became more raucous, the conversations more suggestive. Blake caught snippets of dialogue as he moved through the room, talk of boundaries being pushed, of exploring new experiences. It didn't take long for him to realize that this wasn't just any party. He found Dorothy again, this time talking to Jason, another old friend. They were standing too close, their conversation too quiet, too private. Blake felt a surge of anger but pushed it down, reminding himself to stay calm. "What's up with everyone tonight?" Blake asked Jason, trying to sound casual. Jason looked at him, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "It's just a wild party, man. Everyone's here to have a good time." Blake forced a smile, but his unease only grew. Something wasn't right, and he could feel it in his gut. The glances, the whispers, the way Dorothy seemed to be avoiding his gaze. It all pointed to something he wasn't prepared for. As the night continued, the party took on a darker tone. The music shifted to a slower, more sensual rhythm, and the laughter turned into quiet murmurs. Blake noticed people slipping away into side rooms, doors closing behind them. The house, once filled with lively chatter, now felt oppressive, as if it were closing in on him. Blake found himself drifting back to the main room, where he caught sight of Dorothy again. She was laughing at something Darren had said, her hand resting lightly on his arm. The sight sent a jolt of anger through him, and he could no longer ignore the warning signs. "Dorothy, I think we should go," Blake said, stepping up beside her. Dorothy turned to him, her expression hard to read. Why? We just got here. As the night wore on, Blake felt increasingly out of place. The laughter around him was too loud, the touches exchanged between guests too lingering. Every smile felt like a smirk, every glance a silent mockery. "I need to use the bathroom," Dorothy suddenly announced, interrupting his thoughts. She leaned in, planting a quick peck on his cheek before slipping away down the hallway. Blake watched her go, an uneasy feeling churning in his gut. Something wasn't right, and the nagging suspicion that had been simmering all night was now boiling over. He needed to clear his mind, to make sense of the growing dread gnawing at him. He decided to take a walk around the house, hoping the movement would calm his nerves. As he wandered through the unfamiliar rooms, he noticed how the party had thinned out. The earlier buzz of conversation had quieted, replaced by hushed tones and occasional bursts of laughter. Blake's steps slowed as he passed by a partially open door. Muffled voices floated through the gap, their tone low and conspiratorial. He wouldn't have paid it any mind if one of the voices hadn't sounded so familiar. "You sure he's not going to find out?" a male voice asked, laced with a mix of amusement and doubt. "He's too clueless," Dorothy's voice replied, followed by a light, dismissive giggle. Blake's heart plummeted, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. He froze, hand hovering inches from the door. His mind raced, trying to convince himself that he had misheard, that there was some other explanation. But deep down, he knew better. His instinct screamed at him to walk away, but the pull of the truth was too strong. With a trembling hand, he pushed the door open just enough to peer inside. What he saw made his blood run cold. Dorothy was sprawled across a large bed, her clothes in disarray, a look of flushed excitement on her face. But it wasn't just her presence in the bed that sent Blake's world crashing down. It was who was with her. On either side of her were Darren and Jason, two of Blake's closest friends. Dorothy's hands were wrapped around their Joggensons, their fingers tracing lines on her skin, her smile one of pure satisfaction. Blake's vision blurred, his breath catching in his throat. Rage, betrayal, and heartbreak surged through him in a torrent, leaving him rooted to the spot. His mind screamed at him to do something, to say something, but no words came. All he could do was stare at the scene before him, the scene that shattered every illusion he'd held about his life. "Babe, you can join us, or get the fuck out," Dorothy said suddenly, her voice dripping with a taunting edge as she met his gaze. Her eyes held no remorse, only a cold challenge, daring him to react. For a moment, the room was silent, the air thick with tension. Blake's hands clenched into fists at his sides, his knuckles white. He wanted to scream, to lash out, to demand answers, but all he could feel was a numbness spreading through his chest, dulling the sharp pain of betrayal. Without a word, Blake turned on his heel and walked out of the room, his steps slow and deliberate. As he left, the sound of Dorothy's laughter followed him, a cruel reminder of the moment his world had collapsed. He kept walking, down the hallway, past the living room where the remnants of the party continued, oblivious to the turmoil inside him. He reached the front door and stepped out into the cool night air. He felt hollow, as if everything that had defined him, his marriage, his friendships, his life, had been stripped away in an instant. Blake took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, but it was no use. The weight of what he'd just witnessed was too much to bear. Finally, he walked down the steps, each movement mechanical, devoid of purpose. He didn't know where he was going, only that he needed to get away, to escape the nightmare that had taken hold of his life. Blake didn't remember how he made it out of the house. His legs moved on autopilot, carrying him away from the nightmare he had just witnessed. The cool night air bit at his skin, but it did nothing to cool the fury blazing within him. His mind was a whirlwind, the image of Dorothy with Darren and Jason playing over and over like a broken film reel. "I can't let this go," he muttered to himself, his voice low and hard. His fists clenched, nails digging into his palms as he replayed Dorothy's mocking words, her taunting expression. "I won't let them get away with this." He continued walking, his steps quickening as anger surged through him. As Blake wandered the empty streets, an idea began to form, It was a reckless idea, one that carried risks he couldn't fully predict. But the more he thought about it, the more it solidified into a plan. He couldn't just walk away and pretend everything was fine. He couldn't let them walk all over him, humiliating him without facing any consequences. He stopped walking, standing in the middle of a quiet street. The night was still, only the faint sound of distant traffic breaking the silence. Blake took a deep breath, slowly. A sense of purpose began to replace the chaos in his mind. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming control, about making sure they knew that what they had done had consequences. Blake turned around, his eyes narrowing as the plan fully formed in his head. He was going back. But this time, he wasn't returning as the broken, betrayed husband. He was returning as a man with a plan, a man ready to exact a price for the betrayal he had suffered. Blake made his way back to the house, his steps measured, his mind clear. He paused outside the house, taking one last deep breath to steady himself. He looked up at the house, a grim smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He had a plan now. The house was still alive with the sounds of the party as Blake slipped in through the back door, unnoticed by the revelers inside. Laughter and music echoed down the hallway, but he was deaf to it all. His focus was singular, his purpose clear. He moved swiftly, his steps silent as he made his way to Darren's garage where he knew the toolbox was kept. His hand hovered over the light switch in the garage before he decided against it. No need to draw any attention. The dim glow from the small window provided just enough light for him to see the tools lined up neatly on the workbench. He grabbed what he needed, a pair of wire cutters, a screwdriver, and a small flashlight, his hands trembling slightly as he did so. This was real. There was no turning back now. Blake took a moment to steady himself, gripping the tools tightly. His mind flashed back to the sight of Dorothy with Darren and Jason, her mocking words, their betrayal. The anger that had been simmering beneath the surface flared up, pushing aside any last vestiges of doubt. He wasn't here for them to make amends. He was here to deliver consequences. He slipped out of the garage and crept through the house, avoiding the rooms where the party was in full swing. The chatter and laughter were muffled now, as if coming from a distance, drowned out by the blood pounding in his ears. He knew where he needed to go. The basement. Reaching the basement door, Blake paused for a moment, listening. No one had noticed his absence or return. He turned the handle slowly, carefully, and slipped inside, closing the door behind him with a soft click. The darkness of the stairwell enveloped him as he descended, each step taken with the precision of a man who knew exactly what he was about to do. At the bottom of the stairs, Blake flicked on the small flashlight. Its beam cut through the blackness, illuminating the basement's concrete walls and the large, metal electrical panel mounted on one of them. He approached it, the weight of the moment settling in his chest. This was it, the point of no return. Blake stared at the panel, the switches and wires laid out before him like the final piece of a puzzle. His hand hovered over the panel, hesitating for just a second as the gravity of what he was about to do sank in. Then, with a resolute breath, he set to work. He used the screwdriver to remove the panel cover, his movements quick and efficient. The metal gave way with a slight creak, revealing the tangle of wires behind it. Blake's hand was steady now, his earlier tremors gone, replaced by a cold determination. He knew which wires controlled the power to the house. Darren had once shown him during a routine repair. With the wire cutters in hand, Blake began severing the connections, one by one. Each cut felt like a small victory, a step closer to the reckoning he had planned. The lights above flickered, dimmed, and then went out entirely, plunging the house into complete darkness. The sudden silence that followed was jarring, as if the house itself had taken a breath and was now holding it, waiting for what was to come. Blake stood in the darkness, listening to the chaos that erupted upstairs. Voices called out, confused and alarmed, the music dying abruptly as the power failed. He could hear footsteps above him, people stumbling in the dark, cursing the sudden blackout. But he wasn't concerned with them. His focus was on the room where he had left Dorothy, Darren, and Jason. He knew they would be caught off guard, bewildered by the sudden loss of power. And that was exactly what he wanted. Blake took a deep breath and allowed himself a small, grim smile. They thought they had control, thought they had the upper hand. But they were wrong. The sudden darkness threw the party into a frenzy. Blake stood still for a moment, savoring the sounds of confusion and panic as people fumbled around, their shouts echoing through the house. Glasses clattered to the floor, chairs scraped across tiles, and bodies bumped into one another as everyone tried to make sense of the blackout. "What the hell is going on?" Darren's voice bellowed from upstairs, a mix of irritation and fear. Blake remained in the shadows, listening, a twisted sense of satisfaction coursing through him. They had no idea what was happening, no clue that he was orchestrating their chaos. He moved silently through the house, avoiding anyone who might stumble into his path. He wanted to observe the unfolding mayhem, not be a part of it. At least, not yet. "Everyone, just stay calm. It's probably just a fuse," she called out, her voice cutting through the noise. Blake felt a surge of satisfaction. Dorothy was wrong, and she had no idea what was about to hit her. As he neared the living room, he paused, listening to the confusion playing out in the darkness. People were bumping into furniture, muttering curses, searching for their phones to use as makeshift flashlights. But they were all just background noise to Blake. His mind was already on the next steps of his plan. He had set the stage. Now it was time to deliver the final act. Blake switched off the flashlight and moved silently back up the stairs. As he reached the top of the stairs, he heard Dorothy's voice cutting through the din, sharp and panicked. "Blake? Blake, where are you?" Her tone was laced with desperation, and for a moment, Blake felt a flicker of something. Pity, perhaps, but it was quickly snuffed out by the memory of what she had done. He stayed silent, knowing she was probably terrified. That was what he wanted, after all. He continued down the hallway, his steps careful and deliberate, heading toward the bedroom where he had found her earlier. The voices of Darren and Jason grew louder as he neared the door, both men trying, and failing, to mask their own fear. "Don't worry, it's just a power outage," Darren said, though the tremor in his voice betrayed him. "We'll find some candles or something." Blake reached the doorway and stopped, his breath steady despite the adrenaline pumping through his veins. He peered into the room, his eyes adjusting to the faint light filtering in from outside. Dorothy was huddled on the bed, clutching the sheets around her, while Darren and Jason stood nearby, clearly at a loss for what to do. Blake felt his heart pounding in his chest, but he kept his movements slow and controlled. He wanted to see their faces when they realized what was coming. With a calculated motion, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the flashlight, aiming it toward the floor. He flipped it on, the beam slicing through the darkness and landing on their feet. The sudden light startled them, and all three heads snapped in his direction. He slowly raised the flashlight, the beam traveling up their bodies until it finally illuminated their faces. The fear in their eyes was palpable, and Blake relished it. "Blake." Dorothy's voice was a mix of relief and terror, but mostly terror. She made a move to get off the bed, but something in Blake's cold, steady gaze froze her in place. She stared at him, wide-eyed, the reality of the situation dawning on her. "What's the matter, Dorothy?" Blake's voice was eerily calm, almost conversational. "Not having fun anymore?" The room was silent except for the faint sound of someone breathing too hard. Probably Darren, who seemed to be frozen in place, his mouth slightly open as he tried to comprehend what was happening. "Blake, listen," Darren began, taking a hesitant step forward, but Blake cut him off with a sharp motion of the flashlight, the beam flicking up to his face. "Shut up," Blake snapped, the calm in his voice evaporating for just a second, replaced by something darker, more dangerous. Darren stopped in his tracks, his eyes wide with fear. Jason, who had been silent up until now, tried to play it cool. "Hey man, we didn't mean for things to get out of hand." "You didn't mean for things to get out of hand?" Blake interrupted, his voice rising slightly, the controlled facade beginning to crack. "You didn't mean to betray me? To sleep with my wife?" The accusations hung in the air, heavy and damning. Dorothy flinched, as if the words themselves had struck her. She opened her mouth to say something, anything, but no words came out. What could she possibly say? Blake took a step closer, the flashlight beam steady on the three of them. He could see the fear in their eyes now, The realization that this wasn't just a prank, that Blake wasn't going to let this slide. He wasn't the clueless, trusting husband they had all taken him for. "I trusted you," Blake said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "All of you. And this is how you repay me?" Jason tried to speak again, but Blake cut him off, his voice now cold and sharp. "Get out, all of you, out of this house." For a moment, none of them moved. They seemed too stunned to process the command, too afraid to disobey. Then slowly, they began to gather their things, moving with the reluctant speed of people who knew they had no choice. Darren was the first to slink past Blake, his shoulders hunched, eyes avoiding Blake's gaze. As Dorothy moved to follow, Blake grabbed her arm, stopping her in her tracks. She looked up at him, tears brimming in her eyes, but Blake's expression was unreadable. He leaned in close, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not done with you," he said, his grip tightening just enough to make her wince. Then he let her go, and she hurried after Darren and Jason, the three of them stumbling out into the hallway, out of his sight. Blake stood there in the darkened room, listening to their hurried footsteps fading away. He knew this wasn't the end. Not by a long shot. Dorothy's face drained of color, and for a moment, the weight of what she had done seemed to crash down on her. "Blake, please," Dorothy began, her voice trembling, but Blake silenced her with a sharp wave of his hand. "You had your fun, Dorothy," Blake said, his voice icy and controlled. "Now it's my turn." Darren and Jason scrambled out of bed, their earlier bravado dissolved into sheer panic. They had pushed Blake too far, and they knew it. The arrogance that had carried them through the night was replaced by a desperate fear of what he might do next. "Blake, we didn't mean for this to happen, man," Jason stammered, his voice quivering as he backed away. His eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape, but there was none. "It's too late for apologies," Blake replied, taking a deliberate step forward. The room's tension thickened with each word, suffocating them all. The fear in their eyes only fed the cold resolve within him. They had shattered his life, and he was determined to make them feel a fraction of the pain they had inflicted on him. Blake's steady advance sent Darren and Jason into a panic, their eyes wide with terror. Dorothy, still seated on the bed, started to sob, her shoulders shaking as the reality of the situation closed in around her. The room felt like it was shrinking, the walls closing in, pressing down on them all. "Blake, please, don't do this," Darren pleaded, his voice barely more than a whisper. He reached out a hand as if to reason with him, but Blake ignored it, his gaze fixed on the man who had betrayed him in the worst way possible. But as Blake stood there, his anger boiling over, something began to shift inside him. The fury that had driven him to this point, that had consumed him and fueled his every move, started to fade. It was as if the realization of what he was about to do finally broke through the haze of rage. He could feel the intense heat of his anger give way to something colder, heavier. A deep, overwhelming sadness settled in its place, crushing him under its weight. Blake realized in that moment that no amount of revenge would heal the wounds they had inflicted on him. He could hurt them, make them pay in ways they never imagined, but it wouldn't change anything. The betrayal would still be there, a permanent scar on his heart. Revenge would only drag him down into the darkness with them. His hand trembled as he lowered the flashlight, plunging the room back into darkness. The silence was broken only by Dorothy's quiet sobs and the whispered apologies of Darren and Jason. But the words meant nothing to him anymore. They were empty, just like the promises they had broken. Blake took a deep breath, letting the cold, bitter air fill his lungs. He felt numb, the anger that had once consumed him now gone, leaving behind only an empty void. He turned slowly, not bothering to look back at the three people who had once meant so much to him. Without another word, Blake walked out of the room. The sounds of the party downstairs were distant, muffled, as if they were happening in another world entirely. He kept walking, his footsteps slow and deliberate, until he reached the front door. The cool night air hit his face as he stepped outside, and he breathed it in deeply, savoring the small comfort it provided. Blake didn't look back as he walked away from the house. He knew he could never go back, not after everything that had happened. The life he had known, the life he had built with Dorothy, was over. It had died the moment he saw her with Darren and Jason, and there was no reviving it. But as he walked away, he felt a strange sense of relief. The weight of the night, of the betrayal, was still there, but it was different now. Lighter, somehow. He was free from the lies, the deceit, the pain. It would be a long road to healing. Blake knew that. The scars would never fully fade, but he was ready to start down that path. Away from the betrayal, away from the darkness, and towards something new, something better. Whatever that was, he didn't know yet. But for the first time in a long while, he was ready to find out. The morning at Darren's house. The police cars parked haphazardly outside. Neighbors, drawn out by the earlier commotion, stood in clusters, whispering among themselves. The echoes of the previous night's chaos were evident in the broken glass scattered across the lawn and the remnants of a wild party that had ended abruptly in terror. Dorothy sat on the front steps, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as if she could hold together the pieces of her shattered world. Her face was a mess of smudged makeup and tear streaks, her eyes red and swollen from hours of crying. She stared blankly at the ground, the events of the night replaying in her mind like a nightmare she couldn't escape. A police officer approached her, his face a mask of professionalism, but there was pity in his eyes. "Ma'am, can you tell us what happened?" he asked gently, crouching down to her level. Dorothy didn't respond immediately. Her mind was a fog of regret and disbelief. How had it all gone so wrong? How had she allowed herself to destroy everything that mattered? Finally, she looked up, her voice barely more than a whisper. "It was a mistake, all of it. I never meant for this to happen." The officer exchanged a glance with his partner before continuing. "We need to find your husband. Do you have any idea where he might have gone?" Dorothy shook her head, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "I don't know," she choked out. "He just left. I don't know where he is." The police searched the house, noting the disarray and evidence of a party that had spiraled out of control. The guests had fled in the early hours, leaving behind only the debris of a night that had started with laughter and ended in darkness. But of Blake, there was no sign. As the police continued their investigation, the story began to spread. It started as a rumor, passed from neighbor to neighbor, and quickly escalated into a full-blown scandal. The details were hazy, but everyone knew the gist. A party gone wrong, a husband who had disappeared, and the wife left behind to pick up the pieces. The news reached the small town where Blake had once been a well-known figure, a respected man with a seemingly perfect life. People who had once admired him now whispered behind his back, speculating on where he had gone and why he had left. Some pitied him, others judged him, but no one really knew the truth. Dorothy was left to face the consequences of her choices. She tried to return to some semblance of normalcy, but it was impossible. The house felt empty, haunted by the ghost of her marriage. As for Blake, he had indeed vanished into the night, leaving behind everything that had once defined him. He knew that he couldn't stay, not after what he had witnessed. The betrayal had cut too deep, the pain too raw. So he walked away, not in defeat, but in a bid for freedom from the life that had collapsed around him. In the weeks and months that followed, Blake began to rebuild. He moved to a new town, far from the memories that haunted him, and started a new life.